Welcome back. Today we are joined by Professor Michael Carley, who is a renowned scholar on Stalin. Has written a trilogy on Stalin as well, making, I guess, you one of the leading scholars on Stalin. And I really happy to be able to speak with you because I would like to get a better understanding as well about how the study of Stalin in your perspective contribute to enhance our understanding about geopolitics also of today, and especially then how the historical memory and lessons of history continue to inform. So thank you very much for coming on the program.
Thanks for inviting me.
Well, I think that's probably a good way to start this discussion off with this. How do you see, in your view, the study of the study of Stalin? How does that inform our understanding of geopolitics today, though?
Well, I put the question a little bit differently. How do I see the study of the Russian Federation, the Soviet Union? Stalin was the leader of the Soviet Union for a long time. Um, he's a very controversial figure in history. There's a lot of negativity about him. He's a complicated historical figure. He's responsible for bloody purges in the 1930s, in particular. But he was also the leader of the Soviet Union during the war with Nazi Germany, and he became a very effective war leader. He favored and worked for the consolidation of the Grand Alliance against the Axis powers, and so there's a lot of negative things that one might say about him, but also very positive things. And as a leader of the Soviet Union, he was, in many respects, a leader of Russia. He was what I would call a Russian Gasuдар. And he was a realist, and Western historians, when they look at the foreign policy of the Soviet Union, they often say, well, the Soviet Union didn't have a foreign policy. It had a policy of world socialist revolution, and Soviet policy didn't exist for the Soviet government. When you begin to explore the Soviet archives, which were opened at the beginning of the 1990s, the first thing that jumps out to the historian's eye is the fact that national interest was, at least in the Soviet Foreign Ministry, the most important consideration of in the making of Soviet policy. And the Western assessment that the Soviet Union had no foreign policy is mistaken. So I think it's important to stress the continuity in policy in Russian and Soviet policies. There's very little difference between them. Tsar Alexander III at one point said that Russia's only friends were its army and its navy. And my bet is that if you talk to many Russians today, they would say exactly the same thing. You can't count on anybody but yourself. So the parallel that I would emphasize is what I would call the cold-blooded realism of the Russian government and its vital concern with the security of its borders and its near abroad. I don't think that most Russian diplomats would compromise on those fundamental interests. They didn't before the Second World War, and they certainly do not now. Yeah, but there's also another aspect of Russian policy and Soviet policy with that we don't that seems to go unnoticed in the West, and that is the desire of the Soviet and Russian side for decent relations with the Western powers and with the West in general. And even Soviet policy, Soviet diplomats as early as 1918, merely a few months after the Bolshevik seizure of power in Petrograd in November of 1917, began to pursue an improvement of relations with the Western powers. Even then they called it peaceful coexistence. And then there's the question of the use of history with regard to the USSR and the Russian Federation in the West. And I have a course that I teach on. Well, I have several courses that I used. I'm retired now, as of the 1st of September, but I had courses on the Second World War and Soviet foreign policy and so forth and so on. And one of the first things that I said to my students when I'd start a new course with them was that the history that I was going to discuss with them was not a history that was purely historical, that it had become history that in the West that had become politicized and essentially turned into anti-Russian propaganda, which bore no resemblance to facts which emerged from the study of various national archives. And you asked about Madame Callas. Is that how we pronounce her name? Callas?
Yeah, I think so. That's yeah. Well, she had a comment though, not that long ago that well, she was very dismissive of the whole idea that Russia and China were winners in the war against fascism. But of course, recently she made another comment that over the past 100 years, no country has attacked Russia, but Russia has attacked like 19 countries. So I guess she might have skipped some of her history classes, but nonetheless, this the wider effort to denigrate or to denigrate the Soviet and well Russian contribution to defeating Nazi Germany, it's not a new thing, and it's something that really makes the Russians quite angry. And again, this is interesting because why would it be such a great incentive on the European side to undermine the role of Russia, and why is it so important for Russia to uphold it? So I was therefore wondering, how do you see this? Of course, she has the most immature approach to this, and often the most absurd one, given that she doesn't seem to grasp very basic facts.
Oh, my first thought was that she ought to have taken some of my courses at my undergraduate courses at the University of Montreal, because her remarks bear no resemblance to the reality as I understand it from about 50 years of study of the history of the Soviet Union and Russia. And her remarks about China and Soviet Union and their roles in the war are an insult to the Chinese people and the Russian people. Start with the Chinese. They began full all-out war between Japan and China began in 1937. 1937, and the Chinese. I forget the exact figure of uh, of uh, of losses of amongst the Chinese people in resisting uh, Japanese aggression, but it's it's a very high figure. I think maybe 15 million, something like that, and it's a complicated history. The history of the Chinese involvement in the Second World War because of the differences between the Chinese Communist Party and the Kuomintang of Chinese of Chiang Kai-shek, but nevertheless, the resistance of the Chinese to the Japanese was very important and simply cannot be ignored. And that's even more so the case with the resistance of the Soviet Union to the Nazi the Axis powers after the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 1941. And I can just give you a couple of figures here to underline the importance of the Soviet role in the destruction of the Nazi armed forces. The accepted figure now for the percentage of Nazi forces destroyed by the Red Army is about 80% by the end of the war. That is to say, the Red Army was responsible for the destruction of about 80% of Nazi ground forces, and that's not including the destruction of large numbers of divisions of the Italian, Romanian, and Hungarian armies that were involved in the fighting in the Soviet Union during the war. From June 1941 to July September 1943, the Red Army fought alone against Nazi ground forces and their allies in on the Eastern Front.
Well, you have some polls, though, showing how the perception of this, again, not just from people like Callas, but there's this YouGov poll from 2018, and it revealed that only 11% of Americans and 15% of French believed that the Soviet Union had contributed the most to defeating
That's right.
Nazi Germany, which is kind of extraordinary. And then you can also see polling done in France, how it changed over time, because in 1945, it was about 57% of French recognized that the Soviets had been mostly responsible for defeating Nazi Germany, which still sounds a bit low. But then if you forward gradually decade by decade, this polling is now down to 15%. So this is not informed by history. I mean, if every year this number drops, then this is well, call it propaganda, narratives, ideology, but it doesn't really make any sense. How do you end up in America with 11% recognizing that is the Soviets were the main force? I mean, this is extraordinary.
Well, let me give you some other statistics to underline that point. From June 1941 to September 43, the Red Army fought alone against Nazi armed forces. On the European continent, there was not one U.S., British, Canadian division fighting again on the ground against the Wehrmacht. Not one was to be found engaged against the common enemy. In North Africa, there were 2 or 3 German divisions fighting against the British. On the Soviet front at the same time, there were more than 200 Nazi divisions, not to mention the Italian, Romanian, Hungarian, and Finnish divisions arrayed against the Red Army. So let's say that this is a point that I underline in my course on the Second World War, which shocked some of my students. Let's say the Red Army fought against 99% of German divisions and the Western Allies 1%. The fate of Nazi Germany was decided at the Battle of Stalingrad, which ended at the beginning of January 1943, or the end of January 1943, or the beginning of February 1943. That was the view of the U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt. So consider the dates. The beginning of February 1943. That's 16 months before the Normandy landings. The fate of Germany was settled by the Red Army at Stalingrad. The Western Allies, of course, we shouldn't never, God forbid that we should underestimate the contribution to the war of the United States and Britain. But they gave a helping hand to the Red Army with boots on the ground, not the other way around. And it's important to remember. It's important to remember that the Soviet Union suffered 27 million people who died during the war, of which 18 million were Soviet civilians and perhaps 9 million were Soviet soldiers. And the losses in comparison by, say, the British and the Americans were trivial by comparison. And Madame Callas, I don't know what what I could say that she's a kind of charlatan, an anti-Russian propagandist, not a historian, and really not much of a diplomat either.
But a lot of this suspension didn't start with Callas. In the 2000s, especially around 2008, we saw that the European Union, they began to not just rob the Soviets or the Russians of their role in defeating Nazi Germany, but more and more of these communications came out, which began to identify both Germany as well as the Soviet Union for starting the war. And again, this seems to have been organized under this idea that, the World War II was essentially between liberal democracies versus autocracies, and given that both the Soviet Union and Germany were autocracies, then they were kind of both to blame for the war. And of course, a lot of it was resting on some of the selective memory of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. But again, this is something that is still discussed. Some discuss it, others just present it as a given, as a fact that of course the Soviets were also to blame. But how do you see this wider context and address this allegation, if you will?
Well, the first thing I would say is that the attempt to blacken the reputation of the Soviet Union with respect to the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact didn't begin in 2008. It began in the autumn of 1939, and that was the British at that time. The British took the lead in launching a campaign against the Soviet Union for having concluded the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact. And if you look at the iconography at the time, by iconography I mean political cartoons and posters. The main theme of that iconography in the West was, you'll see images of Hitler and Stalin drinking beer together, clinking their beer glasses together, walking arm in arm. They're represented as pals, friends. The key word you hear then as now is that they were allies. That's but that's not what they were. They were not allies. They were involved in a kind of I compare them to two scorpions doing a dance around one another with their tails raised high, ready to strike one another. David Lowe, who was a very important, in fact, iconic British cartoonist at the time, portrayed images of Hitler and Stalin walking arm in arm, but each one of them had a pistol that they were holding in the other hand behind their backs, ready to use against one another. And the context of in which the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact was signed is never mentioned. And the context is 6 years of Soviet efforts between late 1933 and August of 1939 to conclude a defensive political and military alliance, especially with France and Britain, against Nazi Germany. And the reaction, and this may surprise and astonish your listeners, the reaction of the West to these overtures from the Soviet side was negative. The United States, France, the United Kingdom, even fascist Italy, Romania, one by one, they abandoned interest in Soviet overtures about the Organization of Peace and Security in Europe. One shocking example of this is events in March, April 1939. On the 17th of April of that year, 1939, the Soviet Union offered to the French and British a formal political and military alliance against Nazi Germany. Remember that in the spring of 1939, everybody knew that war was coming, that war was inevitable, that it could break out at almost any time. There was great danger, therefore, to the security of the Western powers, such as they remained at that time, but especially of France and Britain. Okay, and so we had this offer from the Soviet side at the end of 6 years of disappointment with attracting the Western powers into cooperation with the Soviet Union against Nazi Germany. And the British refused, declined the Soviet offer in early May of 1939. They just, it's an incredible, even for me now, it's hard to understand how they could have done that with war threatening to break out at any time. They refused the Soviet offer. There were negotiations in the summer of 1939, last-ditch efforts to conclude an alliance, a tripartite alliance against Nazi Germany. And still the British and the French dragged their feet. They sent delegations to Moscow in August of 1939. But the delegations did not have plenipotentiary powers to conclude a warfighting alliance with the Soviet Union. The formal British instructions to their delegation going to Moscow was, I'm quoting here, go very slowly. Go very slowly. The Soviet Union had very good intelligence sources, and they were aware of what essentially was the duplicity of the French and the British. And therefore, at this point, we're in August of 1939. Soviet intelligence indicated that the Nazi Germany could attack Poland almost at any moment. And so, seeing that the British and the French were not serious about a war-fighting alliance against the Soviet, against Nazi Germany, they opted for a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany that would keep the Soviet Union out of the war.
It's often said that the French and British were hoping that they could direct, in Munich, that they could direct the German forces eastwards, so they can essentially set up the Soviets against the Germans. How do you assess this argument? But also, what was the role of the Poles? Because Poland it had a key role, didn't it, in preventing the Munich deal from preventing the Soviet Union from establishing a partnership with the Western countries to contain Germany early on, so they wouldn't have to. Yeah, so they didn't end up with a Munich agreement.
Poles now are often, or mostly in the West anyway, are portrayed as victims of the Nazi Soviet non-aggression pact. Stabbed in the back, so to speak, is an image that's often used by the Poles. But in point of fact, the Poles played a very negative role in the 1930s with respect to the origins of the war, and they were spoilers and saboteurs of the collective security and mutual assistance that the Soviet side wanted to organize with the West. For example, I want to be fair to the Poles in one sense. They saw themselves as caught between two potentially hostile great powers, Germany on one side and the Soviet Union on the other side. But the great question of the 1930s was who was enemy number one, Nazi Germany or Soviet Russia or Soviet Union? And the Poles, like many sections of the governing elites in Europe, they got the answer to that question wrong. And the Poles, when it came to it, if they had to make a choice between Germany and the Soviet Union, opted for the German side. For example, the Poles signed a non-aggression pact with Germany in January 1934, in spite of efforts at the time by the Soviet government to improve relations with the Soviet Union. The Poles opted throughout that period to sabotage an improvement of relations, particularly with the French and also with the Romanians. Romanian Soviet relations at the time were fairly positive because of somebody that most of your listeners will never have heard of. His name was Nicolae Titulescu, who was the Romanian foreign minister, and he was a strong supporter of collective security with the Soviet Union. But the Poles saw Titulescu as a kind of a freak, an enemy, and their legation in Bucharest worked with the with the Germans and Italians to get Titulescu shot. In fact, some Polish elements threatened to assassinate Titulescu. In 1938, the Poles collaborated with the Germans in the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia, and they even took a little chunk of Czechoslovakian territory as their reward for assisting the Nazis in the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia. When in 1939, when these last ditch efforts were made to organize an alliance against Nazi Germany, the Poles still acted as spoilers, and refused to be associated with any organization of security of a defensive alliance against Nazi Germany. Even in August of 1939, if you read the Polish press in Warsaw, and believe me, the Soviet embassy in Warsaw did read the Polish press. One of the headlines at the time was, "Isn't Vasily a swine? Isn't Vasily a swine?" The Poles were still expressing their hostility and contempt for the Soviet Union. 2 weeks, a week, a few days before the Germans invaded Poland. So in answer to your question, the Poles played a very negative role, destructive role in the 1930s in attempts to organize resistance against Nazi Germany. In fact, I call them skunks in the woodpile, skunks in the woodpile of efforts to protect European peace and security in the 1930s. Skunks.
I wanted to ask also about the historical memory of Holodomor, that is the famine they had in Ukraine, because a lot of scholarship in the 1990s, that is, I think in 94, there's a great article by Barry Pawson who writes that, who wrote that, if this famine is accepted to be a famine as a consequence of essentially a Georgian dictator, which would be Stalin, then this shouldn't mean much. Then it will just be a famine and a tragedy. However, if there would be any efforts to portray this as somehow being a Russian plot against Ukraine, which he argued it was not, then this would then unleash, civil war within Ukraine, but also it would instigate the war between the Ukrainians and the Russians. Now, so this is a sensitive topic, and it kind of points to how dangerous genocide politics can be by claiming genocide. But in December of 2022, the European Union, of course, this was after Russia went into Ukraine, the European Union labeled the Holodomor famine as a genocide against the Ukrainian people. Now, once you have identified who was the victim, of course, then you have to look towards who is the perpetrator. And then, they suggest that everything points towards Russia. So now you created the relationship between these two peoples, both within Ukraine, but also as neighboring countries, as being between the one committing genocide and the victim of genocide. So again, never leave history to the politicians. So this is why I ask you, how do you assess this tragic chapter in Soviet history, this famine at Holodomor?
The first thing I would say is that I don't have any skin in the or stakes in this debate that goes on about the famine in the Soviet Union, 1932-33. I had, I have an interest in it, but it's not, a central. It doesn't play a central role in my research on Soviet foreign policy and Stalin's foreign policy. But I do have my my professional opinions about it. And the first thing that I would say is that I think the best recent account of the famine that took place in that period is in Stephen Kotkin's second volume of his enormous, voluminous biography of Stalin. And his view, and Kotkin is not, he's not a propagandist for the Russians or for Putin or for Stalin. He's I think he's just giving a good, how should I say, honest historian's point of view based on the evidence that he examined. And his conclusion was that there was a famine in 1932, but it was not a deliberate attempt at genocide by the Stalin government against the people, peasantry in the Ukraine. And moreover, I'm just summarizing briefly his views and some of my own. The famine was the result of many factors. Amongst the most important were Stalin's rapid industrialization and collectivization of agricultural lands at the end of the 1920s. This is a long story, complicated, but to summarize in a few minutes. But just to say, the collectivization of prompted widespread peasant resistance and essentially a peasant rebellion. The late Isaac Deutscher, who was a Polish historian and biographer of Stalin and Trotsky, called it a Luddite rebellion of the peasantry, Soviet peasantry, and by Luddite he was referring to the action of British workers in the early 19th century, protesting against poor pay, working conditions, and in Great Britain. They destroyed their machinery, and the rebelling peasants in the Soviet Union did something similar. They slaughtered their livestock, burned their grain, broke their plows and farming equipment to deny it to Soviet collective farms. The slaughter of livestock was so devastating that full recovery of these populations of livestock, cattle, pigs, and so forth and so on didn't occur until after the Second World War in the 1950s. In addition, weather conditions became adverse in 1932. There was too much rain in the spring, not enough during the summer. There were crops were attacked by vermin, and the famine spread throughout to most of the Soviet wheat belt. And in fact, the hardest hit areas of that famine were in Kazakhstan and not in Ukraine. There were Soviet relief efforts off and on during this period, but they were mostly bungled by the Soviet government. So my conclusion, and Kotkin's also, if I can summarize my understanding of his views, is that there was a devastating, deadly famine, but it was not aimed solely against the peasantry in the Ukraine, and it was certainly not an attempted genocide of that population. There was, in fact, a recovery that took place in 1934. So the so-called Holodomor did not single out the Ukraine, did not single out the peasantry of the Ukraine for genocide. That's a political myth, an aspect of the Western political propaganda aimed against the Soviet Union. Read the Russian Federation. I'm not attempting, and by any means, to exonerate the Soviet government's responsibility for what happened at the time, and Stalin's responsibility. But, like so many other aspects of the history of the Soviet Union, when politicians get hold of it, they turn it into anti-Russian propaganda and basically into rubbish.
Well, let me ask a last question. Preceding World War II, that is the Winter War in Finland, because in this part of the world it is quite relevant now, because Sweden and Finland, of course, have joined NATO, and there's a new narrative coming out of Finland that no country knows more about having to fight for their freedom than Finland. So they're essentially building up a narrative now that NATO is how they will be able to preserve their security. But and they had their war with the Soviets. Of course, it was preceded. Well, afterwards you had the neutrality as a peace in the peace agreement with the Soviet Union, and since then, after World War II, they didn't have any more fighting. But it is interesting, therefore, that they're revisiting that history, and that is the war before the Second World War, when the Soviet Union attacked Finland over this Winter War. But from what I understand, the Soviet motivation was to prevent Finland from being used as a possible Soviet launching pad against the Soviet Union. But towards this end, of course, one can argue that this was counterproductive if it only emboldened the Germans, essentially, due to the, I guess, flawed fighting of the Soviet forces.
Well, I'd like to promote my trilogy with respect to the Winter War, because in volume 3 of the trilogy, I deal extensively with the Winter War. It's a complicated subject, but basically, I concluded, based on the evidence that I discovered in the archives, that Stalin made a mistake with. Well, it's easy to say in hindsight that he made a mistake, but it's hard to have sympathy for Finland at the time. It was close to. Had sympathy for Nazi Germany. Not that Finland was alone in that respect. Most of the countries in Europe, most of the elites in Europe were very sympathetic to fascism and Nazi Germany, but the Soviet side saw Finland as a potential collaborator with Nazi Germany in any war potential war with it launched against the Soviet Union. So the Finns, from the Soviet point of view, were potential adversaries, and there is their context with respect to Soviet-Finnish relations in late 1939. Stalin had great successes. He concluded the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact. He succeeded in keeping the USSR out of the war. He obtained spheres of influence in Eastern Europe, arising out of the agreement with Nazi Germany. He recovered territories in Belarus and the Ukraine, which had been taken by Poland in 1919 and 1920, when the Soviet Russia and Poland were at war. He negotiated security agreements in September, October, with Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, intended to secure approaches to Leningrad. Stalin was on a roll. He was on a roll. He could do no wrong. He was like I like to compare Stalin to a gambler who playing roulette at the casino, and he's at the roulette table, and he's calling all the right numbers, and he gets the idea that he can't lose, that he can't lose. And he took this attitude, as I see it, into negotiations with Finland, which began in October of 1939, continued into November. And basically, what Stalin wanted to do was move the Soviet-Finnish frontier further away on the Karelian Isthmus, further away from Leningrad, because the frontier was only about 30 kilometers from Leningrad, and therefore was in artillery range from a hostile Finland. In exchange, he offered a larger, undeveloped territory in eastern Karelia, and there were other details to their negotiations. But the Finns didn't agree, wouldn't accept, were opposed to Soviet terms, and they got encouragement, it seems, from the British side, who didn't want to see the Finns capitulate before the Soviet Union.
So the British were emboldening the Finns to fight on then?
They were emboldened, as I see it, to resist Soviet efforts to conclude an agreement with them based on these territorial arrangements and some other security arrangements. If your listeners are interested in the details, they can read volume 3 of my trilogy. It's chapters 2 and 3, but so the negotiations went badly, and it began to look like there was going to be war. Vyacheslav Molotov, who was was Stalin's right arm, and he was a foreign commissar at the time, said that expressed the view that it would only take 2 or 3 days for the Red Army to get to Helsinki. The Red Army High Command reckoned that it would be 2 or 3 weeks. Well, and Stalin's betting on the roulette wheel. He's thinking all he has to do is pressure the Finns, and they'll throw in the towel. Well, the roulette wheel, it's spinning, and it stops in his number. Finally, it doesn't come up, and war breaks out. There's some question about just exactly how that happened, which I discuss in my book, third volume of the trilogy, which I refer to interested listeners. But basically, the war went very badly at the outset. The Red Army suffered very heavy casualties. But eventually, the Soviet High Command learned from its mistakes, and Finland was obliged to ask for terms in March of 1940. But what most people don't know is that the French government at the time tried to sabotage those Finnish-Soviet relations to end the war, and tried to tried to keep the war going, and had plans to. There were plans to send French and British armed forces across Scandinavia, Norway, and Sweden, to join the fighting against with the Finns against the Red Army. And when the Finnish delegation arrived in Moscow to, for these final negotiations to end the war, the Soviet side had to hide the Finnish delegation to prevent the French from entering into contact with the Finns to try to persuade them not to conclude with the Soviet Union. The French didn't want the war to end. Does that sound familiar to you now?
Yeah, I was gonna say this is
And Jesus Christ, it's incredible. So anyway, the consequences were that, the Soviet Union got what it wanted from Finland, the border, but and the Soviet border in the Karelian Isthmus was pushed away from Leningrad, and there's some other territory that the Soviets took at the time, but Finland retained its independence, such as it was. But the negative aspect for the Soviet Union, apart from terrible casualties, was that the Germans, looking at what happened during the war, concluded that the Red Army couldn't fight, and that it would be easy meat, so to speak, if Hitler at some point in the future decided to make war on the Soviet Union. It's easy to say now, in hindsight, that maybe Stalin made a mistake. That's basically my opinion. But if you were Stalin at the time, winner at the roulette table as he was, thinking that all he had to do was threaten the Finns, and they'd come around. Hard to second guess the decisions that the Soviet government made at the time. Suffice it to say, it's a complicated story, which I described in the third volume of my trilogy on Soviet and Stalin's foreign policy.
well, as we started off saying at the beginning of the program, there's a lot of geopolitical parallels, and there is some repetition here in history. So I will make sure to leave a link to the trilogy in the description, and thank you very much for taking the time. I feel like there's a lot of other topics we could have covered, but we're gonna have to do that some different time.
Thanks a lot for inviting.